Hello everyone. I hope you all got cozy seats and some beer and maybe burgers, although I heard that the burger was shut down until after this talk, so I'll try to be quick. My name is Mihai Cîrlanaru, and this evening I'll be talking about Flux, Relay, and GraphQL in a bit of a nice transition from one to the other, talking about more of an introduction. That's why I called this talk a short story. So I work at State, which is this startup that builds an opinion network, which is sort of a social network, but where the connections are not friends or followers, but actually opinions. And we'll see a bit later what that means. And as some of you might remember, 2 months ago, one of my colleagues had a talk as well, and he was presenting the state.com web app, which is a fully emotionally React Flux application. Right? So you can find me on Twitter, ping me questions or anything while you're watching the slides. I'll make sure to reply. So let's start from the beginning. What is actually Flux, right? And I'll start with an audience question. How many of you have heard of Flux? Can you raise your hand? That's a pretty good number. And I assume in the other room is pretty much everyone as well, right? Then you probably know it's not the Flux capacity. Although some of the Flux implementation have very deep references to that in the future. And what Flux is, pretty much, is a pattern. And I'm sure, since you're all familiar with what Flux is, that you've seen this before, which is the typical ubiquitous diagram of Flux in any web blog post or whatnot you're looking at, right? And then you're looking at this diagram and you ask yourself, okay, but sure, you have some bits there, an action, a dispatcher, a store, a view, some of which sound more or less familiar from having developed applications in React or dug deeper into it. But then it's not really clear, right? This is Flux, is it like a package? Is it like, how do I use it, right? And if you do a quick Google, you'll find out that there's quite a few representations of it: Reflux, Fluxor, Marty, McFly, DeLorean, and so on and so forth, right? And then, with so many different options, I think a good question to ask you guys would be like, how many of you actually use it, right? You've heard of it, but how many of you do use Flux? Right? And this is great, right? We just need a camera to roll around. It's like everyone heard of Flux, but when you ask how many people use it, it's like a very small proportion, I think even less than 10%, right? And I'm pretty sure the main reason, or at least the reason that applied for me a lot, it was like, when you try to use Flux, right, you're more or less in this situation, right? It's like, what is this? I don't even, right? So many different ways of doing it. Flux is a pattern, and it's like, okay, where should I start? So you kind of get scared of it, right? It's no particular way of doing it right. As long as you have this unidirectional flow that actions, stores, and everything, everyone is happy, right? You make your life easier, as they say, right? And let's see why you would make your life easier. Why would you use Flux? What's so great about it? What real life problems does it solve in this particular case, since it's a pattern for building user interfaces with React? And I think the start into answering this question would be to look at something that people are familiar and probably use every day in terms of pattern for building user interfaces. And that's the module view controller, right? Pretty straightforward. you have the view, which with actions that get sent to the control, they manipulate the model, and the model updates the view. Really nice way to separate your application, keep things that are not related to the representation of your logic, which is the view, keep them in the model, and have controllers as a nice way to manipulate that, right? And this is a very simple diagram as well as the Flux one. But then, as everyone notices in practice, this is what really happens. Like you have a wide range of views, quite a few models, and a bunch of controllers. And you go all crazy with these dependencies between them in these flows, that at the point that something breaks, it's like you look at it and you're like, okay, where should I start? Right? It's like hard to keep track of how things are interconnected, especially in a large application. And debugging becomes a nightmare. And finding the source of a bug is actually like finding a needle in a haystack. Right? And then you're basically you're asking yourself, like, what did I get myself into? Right? And that's where Flux comes in, and the problem that it wants to solve is to avoid the cascading effects of these flows from all of the controller by improving the data consistency, having one direction flow, and this also allowing easier debugging, finding the bug is very straightforward, and easier unit tests. So you can use unit tests. And to go through Flux, use this example, and this is actually an opinion on state. This is the equivalent of a Facebook post or a Twitter tweet, and that is Jonas on stage. We had a talk about isomorphic React months ago, as I mentioned. And I'm going to use his opinion about React, which was made in November last year when we kind of started switching our stack to basically rewriting it in React. And I'll use this version of the Flux diagram, which, as you might notice, has no dispatcher, and that's a bit a hint that one of the flavors of Flux, because it's a pattern and it has all these different implementations. And the one we use as state is called Reflux.js. The main difference from the typical Flux pattern is that there's no dispatcher in actions, there's no singleton dispatcher, and in favor of leaving actions be dispatchers themselves. So the action kind of becomes two roles, and it allows for easier separation of actions that are not related. Right? And we start with a view, and now this is a quick separation of how an opinion will be represented in GSX. We call it a statement. It has a header, a body, and then an action bar. And for actions, we have respond, restate, and well said. And an easy way to highlight this Flux flow is to see how an action would go, right? Let's say you want to well say an opinion, which is the equivalent of like Facebook. So we have, this is a more or less abstracted code, removing a bit of a reflux sugar, but the idea is this should apply for any kind of implementation. So we have the actions, we call it endorse, the one for well saying an opinion. We have a handler on the endorse button that what it does, it endorses, sends the action with the ID of that particular statement. And then we have the store, which listens to the action, and what it does, it toggles the endorsement, whether it's like on Facebook with the like button, you like it, you keep clicking again, toggles if you unlike it, right? And it's just kind of the same idea. You do the magic with the endorsement count on the data, and then you trigger that you have updated that data so that the view gets updated, which is showing a count and updating the state of the button. Right? That's pretty straightforward, nothing too crazy. That's how you would use Flux in a, say, a pretty basic application that deals with posts and has actions for those posts. Right? Good. Now here comes the thing: is how about data fetching? And probably that's one of the most underrepresented, for examples, part of using Flux. You all seen Flux, the diagram and everything, and all these representations that are pretty daunting, and switching to using Flux. And also probably one of the reasons is like, okay, how do I talk to my API? How do I get server data into my application? And well, there is a way to do it with Flux. Right. Going back to that diagram, you have again actions that can go from view to the dispatcher, and then you have this other part coming in there, which is the server, which kind of is the middle man in between the action and the dispatcher. So for actions that will require persisting state on the server or getting some new information from the server, you would need to have a component that does an API call, and then the result of that gets sent to the dispatcher, dropping the stores, and that can get pretty complicated, because what happens in this case is that we're coupling the server with the view. So, right? You need to have this connection in order to have everything working properly. But Facebook, because well, they're a big company, and they came up with React in the first place, turns out that they've been using something for quite a bit of time, some of which for 3 years even. Some technology that would make things easier for developers. So we take again the previous diagram, the Flux server diagram, and what Relay does, this new framework called Relay, is it kind of removes some of those bits from the diagram. It still has a store, which is actually managed by the framework, so you don't really care much about it. It has views, but they're not just views. They're actually these wrapped components in this relay container. And then you also have actions, but those are a bit, they're not that relevant as in Flux. And of course the server component. And some quick points on what's its relation with Flux. Is that Relay, and as Facebook puts it, it's somehow inspired by Flux, but with a much simpler mental model. Right? Instead of multiple stores, I said there's only one central store that caches the data in this new format, which is called GraphQL. We'll see in a bit. And instead of having these explicit subscriptions, the framework itself tracks the data for each component and which component should be updated. And instead of actions, the modifications take shape of mutations. And this is that sort of diagram expanded a bit with more details on how things work. So you have the component, you have the action, which, as I said, is not really as in the Flux way. It's more of a description of how data should change. And it goes to the server as a GraphQL write. And as I said, we'll get GraphQL in a second. And updates the store, and the server responds with GraphQL to the store again. And we have this nice flow, which, as we'll see, is pretty much taken care of by the framework. go back to Relay. What is Relay? As Facebook puts it, is a new framework that provides data fetching functionality for React applications. And as I mentioned, this is one of the major walls that developers stumble upon as they develop React applications, because there are not that many real-life examples out there on how to do this right. You can do it as we saw with Flux. There's so many different implementations. Pretty much everyone has their own way of getting data from the server and populating the stores. And then when you take into consideration isomorphic applications that need to render on the server and then on the client as well, then things get a bit more complicated. And yet again, there's no right way of doing it. GraphQL is a data querying language that was designed by Facebook in order to describe, as they say, the complex nested data dependencies of modern applications. And interesting bit is that GraphQL, probably not under this name, I don't know, was not invented to enable Relay, to enable this framework of fetching data for React application. It actually predates Relay by almost 2 years. And it was invented during Facebook's HTML5 driven mobile application switch when they switched to native applications a while ago. And it's pretty much the language for representing and requesting graph data that takes care of all their interactions for the Android and iOS application. And let's go through a quick example on the same opinion component. And this is more of a, let's say, a representation on how you would adapt, let's say, component to use Relay in the future, because as we'll see, Relay is not quite there. So you have the component and this Relay container, this is a wrapper class for the component, which pretty much decorates the component with the necessary queries, data queries that it needs to render. And then you have the props that will go to the component, they go to the container, and then the container populates those props with the relevant query results from the server, the actual data that you need. And at least from their latest blog post, which was earlier this month, this is how such a component would look like. You have your regular component, which you define in React, and then on top of that, you wrap it with Relay, create container, statement, as I said, the component is a statement, and then you list the queries for obtaining the data necessary. And those queries, in this case, you have the statement creator, which has name on the picture, the body, text, opinions, and some other bits and bobs that populate that component. And that's pretty much it in terms of how you use Relay in components. And that, as I said, that syntax for GraphQL is supposedly the latest way of defining queries. It kind of changed from what they announced in early January, the React conference in San Francisco, where Relay and GraphQL was first presented to the world. But again, let's go back to that diagram and try to do a short recap on what's coming up with Relay and GraphQL, right? And as I mentioned, fetching data is a hard problem. And also, especially like one way is implementing this functionality to fetch data. And then conceptually, it's a hard problem in terms of what if the data changes, right? On the spec for the data on your server, then you need to update your various endpoints and your various normalization packages, and you always have to go back and forth. And then you might have these things quite spread in your stack, not an easy way to know what you need to change if an API endpoint response changes, for example. So this is a pretty hard problem. And also in terms of performance, you might request more data than you need, right? As we saw in that statement. You might get a lot of other unnecessary user-related data in the regular RESTful API that you prepare. But for representing this component, you only need the name and the picture. And what Relay actually tries to achieve is to reduce all these different problems that arise from fetching data and moving all the tricky bits in the framework, and freeing developers to concentrate on actually building the application. And this is actually what it's all about. It's all about the component and the way of defining the data for it in GraphQL. And this is all you need trying to build a React application that communicates with the data server. And then this is great, right? We'll probably all like, yeah, I'm totally into getting this new framework and using it for my application. It simplifies development and it allows this very efficient way of getting the data that you need. But as I said, it's not quite there. It's not yet open source. It was announced in January with React Native. React Native apparently got a preferential treatment, got out quicker. Relay, GraphQL, they're still there. They're kind of teasing every other month or so with a blog post on how they build a newsfeed with Relay, or how Relay works, and to get people interested, right? And also probably to test the market. It's like how much interest people have in testing it, if it's really worth going deep in the open sourcing of the project direction, right? And there are a lot of questions. Like, okay, how would routing work in this case? How would you have this working in isomorphic app? And also, like, this GraphQL querying language. Do I need a new type of server? Do I need to have this special layer that translates to GraphQL, and so on and so forth? And if you do some digging, you kind of find various bits of information out there, and I put in some links here. They're mainly linking to Facebook blog posts and this like frequently asked questions page that one of the Facebook engineers that work on Relay about. And there's a lot there. You'll find a lot of information on how things work, and well, at least how things are supposed to work when the open source it, and address some of the concerns about needing if you'd actually need a server or what you have to do in the end. And I really encourage you to go and check them out. It's a lot of good information there, especially if this will come out soon and people are interested in picking it up. And that is, in great lines, pretty much it. Now, if you have any questions, you can ask.
Thank you, Mihai. Any questions?
Yeah, I'll add some points. I tried to make this presentation more of an introductory presentation, because I kind of had the guess that, okay, everyone heard of these things, but they might have read about it quickly, saw it on Twitter, and said, oh, this is cool, but probably not that many people tried it. And as we saw with people raising hands, that was actually the case. And then when Relay and GraphQL will be out, the thing is, they're not trying to replace Flux. simplest way, kind of predicting any question in that direction. They're just trying to offer a simple way of having the data fetching functionality in your React application.
Hi. So you have the line going from the component to the server for the GraphQL query.
Yeah.
Bypass the store. I thought that Relay, one of the jobs it did was to request collapse at that point. Is that, do you know if that's the case or not, or was the diagram just a simplification?
In terms of making the query to the server, you mean?
In terms of when the page loads, taking the queries from all components on the page and collapsing them into one, as simple query as you can get, and then sending that to the server.
Yeah. So the idea with the store is that is managed by the framework. So I don't think we'll have that many information on how it works. You know, it's a simple store and everything happens there. I'm not sure if we'll have fine-grained control over it or anything. And in terms of queries, the way it will supposedly work, at least the way they advertise it in their blog posts, is that each component will define its queries, its data necessities. And then the top-level parent component composes all that queries for it and makes for all the children. And in terms of how those go to the server, it's again the framework that takes care of batching all those queries and making, for example, one request to get everything. There are not that many details around on how this will work, let's say on the server render, right? So isomorphic applications. So I can't say much about that. You might find some more insights in the Olivier's links, or you might not, or Facebook might post in the near future a more detailed piece of information about it.
Thanks. Any more questions?
Tell us a little bit more about your experience with Flux, maybe like the thing that breaks the most with Flux and makes you like the most inflation to switch to something else?
Yeah, let me just repeat that question because probably not everybody heard the beginning of it. So the question was if I can say more about my experience, our experience at State with Reflux and frustrations and like why, pretty much I would assume why Reflux and not anything else, right? That's a pretty good question, right? There's quite a lot of implementations out there, and I'm pretty sure if you check them by the number of stars on their GitHub package or by the time they did the last release, you kind of realize which ones are the most popular ones. Luckily, Reflux is one of them, and when we embarked on this journey, there were not that many out there. I think the Fluxor was one of the popular ones, like a couple of months ago. And
in our case, actually, switch from Fluxor to Reflux as soon as it starts.
okay,
So that was
that's interesting. Yeah. Well, we wanted a way. Actually, one of the good reasons that we kind of went on Reflux from the very start was that it allowed the actions to be their own dispatcher. We didn't want a central singleton dispatcher that lists all possible actions and just like relays them around, right? Routes the actions to the proper stores, because that would have become a bit of a maintainability nightmare, right? So we try to keep these atomic, as showed in this example. Each action has its separate domain and defines particular actions for a particular resource. And then in terms of data fetching, which is something I haven't shown here, we have another bit which we call data providers. And this again is like a very subjective thing. The way we went into the direction of doing data fetching. We have these things called data providers, which are these classes for each resource. They implement this interface that defines an endpoint and the type of action to distribute the data for that resource and normalize it. And then in those data providers, we listen for these actions and we perform the relevant data requests. Like for the endorse, we would update the data on the server. So we would have something similar to what happens in the store, like we listen to the action, and then instead of toggle endorsement, we check, oh, was this endorsed in the data on the server? If so, then we remove it. So we make an API call to delete, for example. Otherwise, we post it, make an API to call this happen asynchronous. The result gets optimistically updated in the store.
Thank you. We can do one more question.
Hey. Okay, so one of the things that actually confused me a lot when they announced GraphQL was the relationship between, like the very tight relationship between GraphQL and the data structure that Facebook uses in the backend, like the completely graph-based database. So I'm wondering, like, as far as you know, of course, is that going to be a limitation how we can structure the applications? Are we going to have to wrap our current architecture around that idea, or is it going to be possible, like say I have a stack of database like Postgres, which is not graph-based, and basically I have to use that. How can I do that with GraphQL?
That's a very good point, and one of the big questions are how can you actually adapt this to your needs. And as far as I understand, going into all the resources available about GraphQL, is that they will provide when this will be open source finally, with the reference implementation of the GraphQL server. And the way it would work with that, like RESTful APIs with databases, we talk GraphQL, because in the end that's all that matters for the React component, for Relay, that there's this endpoint for writing and requesting these kind of queries. I would assume it's either Facebook that provides or the open community provides based on that spec, these adapter layers that do the transformations. So then, to some extent, I assume you will have to explain how your data is structured in this kind of query. So it won't be necessarily dependent on the nesting that they highlight. You have your own nesting, right? But it should be something that can be represented as sort of graph. And that's the way you request them. That's the way the adapter layer will request them.
Thanks, Mihai. That was brilliant.
Thank you very much.